A very, very warm good afternoon to you all, or good morning, good evening, wherever you are. And really, we are grateful that you're able to join us today. It's afternoon here in Rome, and we'll be kicking off shortly. Delighted to see so many people online, and quite a good number in the room. It's filling up really quickly. My name is Waiganjo Njoroge. I head communications at CFS, and it's my absolute pleasure to be your moderator of the day and to warmly, once again, welcome you to this event convened by CFS, the Committee on World Food Security, as part of its brand newest workstream on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition. And we have an extremely exciting program lined up for the next 3 or so hours. We are delighted to have so many of you joining us online. It's a hybrid event, and so before we even jump into it, I'll give a quick overview of some ground rules to enable us run the event as smoothly as we can. Number one, we are recording this session, and the reason we are recording it is we want to have it available for future reference. We are looking forward to a deep, rich discussion, and it will be remiss of us if that discussion stays with the few of us who are part of this conversation. We post it on the CFS website, we push it through our social media networks, and we encourage you all to do the same as well. Number two, just in case we have technical difficulties or we have Zoom bombing, we have done everything possible to ensure that the meeting is safeguarded. But for those of you who are online, if we have difficulties, the meeting is interfered with, we request that you drop off and rejoin using the same link, and we hope that that doesn't happen. Number three, everyone who's joining today will have an opportunity to contribute to the discussion. We invite you to share. That's why we are happy to see you. And so when that moment comes, we have two segments where we will open the floor. We will encourage you to raise your hand, take the floor, share your thoughts, ask your questions, and let's hear what you have on mind. And the last one, please keep your mics muted when you're not speaking so that it doesn't interfere with the running of the session. And now, straight into the meat, the heart of the discussion today. Inequalities. Why are we worrying about this? As a communications person, I survive by asking questions, all sorts of questions. And I've asked my colleagues lots of questions in preparation for this meeting. Questions like, what inequalities are we talking about? How do these inequalities impact food security and nutrition? And probably even more importantly, are there solutions? What policy opportunities do we have to address these inequalities? And the last one, do we have sufficient data? Do we have sufficient research to underpin the work that we are doing? Thankfully, I don't have to answer those questions. I don't have to tell you what my colleagues have said, because that's how we have structured this session, to allow us to hear from you, to respond to those questions, and many more. And this session has a number of elements or segments to it. The first one will be a scene setter. We will hear from the chairperson of the Committee on World Food Security, Ambassador Gabriel Ferrero. He's here with us in the room. We'll also hear from Jo Puri, Associate Vice President here at IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, our gracious host for today. And he should be sharing a bit about us. And Jo, we are really grateful that you hosted us this afternoon. And then we go into the second segment where we will hear a little more about the work that's starting to be done on the scientific front. There will be a presentation of a report by the CFS high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, HLPE-FSN. They have started working on a report that will underpin this policy work that the committee will embark on, and we'll have a presentation on that. And that segment will be followed immediately after by a couple of interventions by representatives of a number of UN agencies. And then the more exciting part for me, opening it up for discussion, to hear your views, to hear your thoughts, reflections on what that report should be focusing on. After which we'll go into the final segment of it. We will have a panel discussion, and I will introduce you at that point to who our panelists are. They will share their views, they will share their insights. So as you can tell, we have a really exciting, rich discussion ahead of us. And we look forward to hearing from not only the speakers, but more importantly, from all of you who have joined us in the room. You can post your questions on chat as we go, raise your hand, and we'll give you the floor as long as time allows us to do that. And now, without further ado, I will invite Ambassador Gabriel Ferrero, CFS Chairperson, for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Waganjo. And dear colleagues and friends, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to warmly welcome you today to this public event on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition, and I would say for much more than food security and nutrition, but through food systems. Being convened by the UN Committee on World Food Security, I have the privilege of sharing. So thank you so much for joining us today, both here in person in Rome, at the headquarters of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, our gracious host today, and as well as those joining virtually. I'm now approaching 100 participants virtual as well. But before providing some reflections at the start of the meeting, allow me to give the floor now, with great pleasure, to the Vice President of IFAD, to Jo Puri, who is representing the host organization today, IFAD. Jo, IFAD has such an important role in the world for reducing inequalities in food systems. So it is my pleasure to give you the floor now. Unfortunately, I know that you have to leave soon after your remarks to continue your duties today. So thank you once again, Jo. The floor is yours, please.
The polycrises that we are witnessing today, the war in Ukraine, the impact of COVID, climate shocks, and the rising costs of food fertilizers have left many in dire situations. Indeed, the distance between us and achieving zero hunger is widening, and 8% of the world's population, nearly 670 million people, will face hunger in 2030. Excellencies, Ambassador, Chair, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you all at IFAD and to provide the opening remarks for what I think is a really important event on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition. I'd really like to take this time to thank the CFS Chair for his leadership and unwavering commitment to addressing food insecurity and malnutrition. The CFS has indeed proven to be a very, very essential convening space for the discussion on food insecurity, as well as on resources that are required during these unprecedented times. I think the recent setbacks that we are witnessing have indicated that we are very far from achieving food security and ending malnutrition in all forms. Imbalances in food systems and unequal access to food markets are major drivers of dietary and nutrition inequities. The food environment, where decisions about what to eat are made, is inequitable for many in terms of physical access, in terms of affordability, in terms of who it targets, in terms of advertising, in terms of marketing, and in terms of quality of food. The interconnected causes of the inequities in food systems requires that we develop an integrated, equity-sensitive approach that is responsive at the global, the national, as well as at the local levels, bringing together the capacity of multiple sectors and multiple actors. Healthier food environments and consumer behavior must be promoted and protected. Social protection and policies associated with social protection need to support the most vulnerable, particularly women, persons with disabilities, and children, and policies must directly address food availability, accessibility, affordability in local food environments. Addressing inequities within food systems is ultimately about addressing power imbalances, amplifying the voice of the marginalized, and holding the powerful to account. IFAD remains committed to supporting the mission of the CFS and the completion of its multi-year program of work. IFAD commends the committee and its members for prioritizing this discussion on inequalities and is heartened to see the collective willingness to complete the CFS multi-year program of work. I'd like to recall a message often shared by the CFS chair. It is time to act together. It is that time, ladies and gentlemen. We need joint collective action to face these challenges and build on our respective strengths and complementarities, because we cannot achieve the SDGs alone. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Vice President. Thank you, dear Joy. Well, colleagues, I guess it's exactly 1 week ago. Today, the human population reached the 8 billion mark. And this milestone is coming at a time of multiple and overlapping global challenges. You pointed out them, Joy, and thanks for being here. And these challenges range from mounting hunger and malnutrition to rural poverty, to climate change, to COVID-19, to biodiversity loss, economic downturns, and escalating conflicts, not least the war in Ukraine these days. And this is a result of all these compounding challenges that over 800 million people are hungry and are growing. This number is growing day by day. And climate change-induced disasters are raving lives and livelihoods. And as it is often the case, it is the vulnerable, the most vulnerable, and those that are most excluded that are suffering most, driven by worsening inequalities in terms of wealth and income, in terms of access to resources, in terms of access to resources including land, water, access to basic services like education, health, and infrastructure, due to overlapping forms of discrimination due to gender, race, ethnicity, age, location, and of course food security and nutrition status. So reducing inequalities in food systems will be a multiplier and an essential driver to reduce overall inequalities. I see 3 keys that will unlock this transformative power. First, empower smallholder farmers and family farmers who produce 80%, around 80% of the world's food, with 1/3 produced by smallholder farmers. They are the key and the cornerstone of reducing inequalities while achieving food security and nutrition. Second, empower rural women and girls and fight gender inequalities. And third, ensuring that all jobs across food systems are decent jobs. Colleagues, the objective today in front of us is to identify issues that will require and that requires particular attention and contribute to the work of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition of the committee in the preparation of the report on this matter that will be released next year. As we all know, under the CFS methodology, the high-level panel of experts report will inform the CFS workstream on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition that will start after CFS 51 in October next year. And this workstream seeks to provide policy responses to widespread negative impacts of inequalities, both within and outside our food systems. Indeed, colleagues, inequalities, both within and outside the bounds of food systems, are highly relevant for the vision and for the mission of the CFS. And the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition of our committee has already made extensive progress with their report on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition, which you will see shortly during the project team leaders' presentation of the version 0 of the draft. As CFS stakeholders, colleagues, this session gives us all an opportunity to provide substantive inputs and contributions towards the preparation of this report. This report, which will be released next year, will then inform the related CFS policy recommendations that will follow. So I therefore invite us all to participate actively today in this very important session. Like all other CFS policy agreements, the high-level panel of experts report, along with the subsequent policy recommendations on this topic, will become very concrete tools for use by governments to inspire our internal and domestic and international development policies, also to be used by UN agencies and entities and other stakeholders in addressing global hunger and malnutrition. So, colleagues, now that our planet is home of 8 billion people, that means 8 billion hopes, dreams and solutions, let us work together, as Joy was urging us, and act now, not just to face this crisis in the very short term, but to reduce inequalities in the fight against poverty, hunger and malnutrition. We know that if we do that this way, and building on the wide number of people that feed the world, 80% of family farmers, including 30% or more of smallholder farmers, we will be capable of transforming food systems sustainably and make them deliver also on poverty eradication, on gender equality, and on the rest of the sustainable development goals. So thank you once again. Now over to you, Waiganjo, for moderating the rest of the event. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for setting the scene for us, and to Jo, who has unfortunately had to leave for other commitments. That gets us in a very good place. And I like what you said, Chair, there towards the end. With 8 billion people, those are 8 billion solutions, 8 billion hopes, but we have to address the inequalities that exist between and amongst us, and that's what you're looking to do. And Chair, you mentioned this report by HLPE-FSN that will be presented to us shortly, the first draft of that report. And online we have with us Professor Bhavani Shankar, who is the leader of the project team putting together this report. Professor Shankar, the floor is yours. I know you have a couple of slides to present. Take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me and see my slides?
We do, Prof. Carry on.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Hello again, everyone. Good afternoon. Really pleased to be here. And my name is Bhavani Shankar, and I am the drafting team chair for this report on HLPE-18 report on reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition. We have an excellent team that's been working away for the last 5 or 6 months, and we've reached a 0 draft of a report, which is shortly going to be put out to e-consultation, and we look forward to all your comments in due course. Now, I must mention that right at the outset that this report is over 100 pages long currently, so I'm not going to try and summarize 100 pages in the 10 minutes or so that I have. But I will provide a broad outline of where we're coming from, the sorts of things that we're covering, and some of the issues which have already been noted, and how we're paying attention to those issues. Start off by noting what's been already noted is that currently the global food systems are extremely unequal, and in many ways, these inequalities are increasing over time. Now, this is true whether we're looking at aspects like access to land, water, other food production resources, whether it's looking at access to technology, seeds, extension services, whether we're talking about value chain participation, power within the value chain. We go further upstream and when we look at international trade, when we look at markets, there are substantial inequalities there. And as also previously discussed, the food environment is an area where there are many, many important inequalities. So these inequalities are present at different levels. There are important inter-country inequalities. There are inequalities across individuals and households within the same country. There are inequalities within households, intra-household inequalities that are important, but also many inequalities that exist between groups, whether it's social identities defined by gender or indigenous groups compared to non-indigenous groups or other aspects of group-based inequality. Now, these inequalities are important not only because in themselves, because in many ways they are unfair, but they're also important because they impact food security and nutrition in many ways through several pathways. One obvious example is, for example, when there is unequal access to modern technology in agriculture or seeds or extension services, that has lost productivity for a fairly important segment of the population, and therefore that translates to reduced food availability and access and other aspects as well. So that is just one example of several pathways through which these inequalities impact food security and nutrition. But we must also keep in mind when trying to understand these problems and trying to devise approaches to solving them, is that these inequalities have systemic and structural drivers, very many of them, deep-rooted problems that we must also think about, that we must consider these inequalities within the context of. So these are aspects like climate change, these are aspects like social norms, these are aspects like fragility, conflict, as we've seen from the Ukraine conflict. These are all things that are driving the inequalities and perpetuating them and the impact that they have on food security and nutrition. So it is important that we pay attention to these deeper drivers as well. So the report that we've been preparing over the last few months does address these food system inequalities and their food security and nutrition, FSN, implications, but also tries to think about the structural processes, the systemic, deep-rooted drivers that drive them. Now, the scope of this work that we've been doing was originally informed by the CFS call for this report that came out originally, which was quite clear in terms of some of the areas. Subsequently, there was an e-consultation on the scope, and there was well over 100 pages of consultation material that helped us guide some of the scope. And of course, there's also expertise within the HLPE that informed this. Now, let me just provide a quick conceptual framework that we're using in our work to inform this work. At the center of this diagram, you see a circle or a donut, which is really what we call the engine of inequality, which is trying to capture the main elements of inequity or inequality that we must think about. One aspect of that is unequal distribution, which is typically the aspect that a lot of work analysis tends to look at: unequal distribution of access to land, access to technologies, unequal access in knowledge, unequal access in social networks, those sorts of things. But we must not forget there are other dimensions, important dimensions to inequality that we must recognize and take into account. Unequal recognition is one important aspect. And that is where certain groups tend to be more invisible than other groups, and perhaps their efforts are less recognized. One obvious example is when women's work is less visible than men's work in agriculture in some settings. So unequal recognition might also apply to indigenous groups where, again, there is a recognition problem. But beyond recognition, there's a representation, which is also important. Unequal representation is an important dimension. Being actually able to participate in decision-making that affects one's well-being within the agri-food sector is an important aspect of inequality. So our approach tries to take unequal distribution, unequal representation, unequal recognition as this engine of inequality. And of course, these feed off each other. And by feeding off each other, they create these inequalities within food systems, which is the boxes that you see in the middle of the circle. as well as inequalities in other systems that are relevant to food security and nutrition, aspects like water, sanitation, health, education, and so on. And these inequalities then go on to affect people's experiences of food security and nutrition, the various dimensions of food security and nutrition. But again, reminding us that we should always not lose sight of what we see on the other end of this diagram, on the left-hand side. That's the systemic, deep-rooted drivers like climate change, which we must always understand the problem within the context of. And also the bar on top, reminding us that intersectional inequalities, where these group identities sort of work with each other to perpetuate further inequality, these are all important aspects to keep in mind. So the report structure is, so we've currently, and this might probably will change as we go along to further drafts, we are still just a work in progress. We start off with an introduction, and the next 3 chapters describe the problem space. First of all, describing the inequalities in outcomes in food security and nutrition FSN outcomes across countries and within population, across groups, and so on. Then we go on and describe, we peel it back one layer and look at the inequalities within the food system and other systems like health and sanitation, which drive some of these unequal food security and nutrition outcomes. What are these important inequalities, and what are that food security and nutrition implications? Then we peel back the layer, one more layer, and look at the systemic drivers and the root causes within which we must understand these problems. And then chapters 5 to 7 look at the solution space in a sense. First of all, they look within the food system for approaches that we might take. Then they look more broadly for transformations towards structural change, towards systemic change, those making improvements in some of those deep-rooted problems and how we can approach that. And then we finish with recommendations and conclusions. To unpack some of these chapters just a little bit, first of all, when looking within food systems, we ask, what are the major inequalities within these food systems, and how do they affect the dimensions of food security and nutrition? We look at access to food production assets, so that's land inequality, inequality in access to livestock assets and fisheries and other kinds of resources, but also inputs, technology, finance, unequal access to that, particularly smallholder farmers, women farmers, and so on. Then we look at value chains and markets, things like difficulties, inequalities and participation possibilities within modern value chains and participation in modern market opportunities. And also questions of power within markets and value chains and how that has an implication for food security and nutrition. We also look at the highly unequal global food trade setting and what that implies for food security and nutrition. And then we look at something closer to the consumer, which is the food environments, looking at various ways in which consumers interact. For example, unequal food prices, affordability of food, where, for example, in some remote areas, food is much more unaffordable than in other areas, perhaps because of poor market functioning. But we also look at other systems and other important areas of inequality. Wealth and income is obviously an important one, but also looking at inequalities within health systems, sanitation, education, and so on. Then we look at the systemic drivers and root causes, looking at cultural social norms that we do need to recognize and take into account when trying to devise approaches to improve things. Power asymmetries across the board. Things like fragility and conflict, the difficulties posed by climate change and climate injustice and how that feeds into inequalities in the food system and beyond. So these are some of the deep-rooted areas that we discuss. Looking at the solution space, first of all, looking within the food system, we start off by looking at some broad principles to any approach in reducing inequality. For example, focusing on agency, which was a dimension of food security and nutrition that was introduced in HLPE report number 15, which really set out agency or the ability to make independent choices within the food system about food system outcomes and activities within the food system. And obviously any inequality is very often associated with a restriction of agency and thereby is extremely important. So agency is an important aspect to grapple with. But also power. Power is right at the heart, as the IFAD speaker pointed out, power is right at the heart of many inequality issues and it must be addressed. But also any solution must be adapted to the local context, so it cannot be one size fits all. So just reminding some of the basic principles and the important principles behind that. After that, we go on to a portfolio of approaches that we consider within the food system, as well as the other systems to reducing these inequalities. And this list that you see here are just examples. So this is not a complete listing. I've just provided these to give an example of the sorts of things we're talking about. Equalizing access to food production resources. For example, working with land markets, equalizing access to land through land markets, through land rental, land reform, and so on. Developing inclusive farmers organizations, boosting public agricultural research with a particular focus on disadvantaged groups, and so on. And then we look at transformative actions, the big picture actions that we must also grapple with. Right to food, which has been a long-running HLPE area that HLPE has been involved in, but also looking at things like how do you get the marginalized groups to be better a part of the governance process in decision making? How do we bring climate equity aspects into this food systems inequalities that we're talking about? Universal access to services, social protection, and so on. So that roughly is what we're doing. This is the brilliant drafting team, some of whom are in this meeting today. And we've got a zero draft that will be put out to e-consultation, and I think you will hear some more details about how to participate in the e-consultation, and we really look forward to listening to comments from everyone. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Prof, for that comprehensive presentation. Looks like the questions are starting to get answered, and I believe that as we go on with the session this afternoon, you will get inputs that you and your team will find useful. As you are speaking, colleagues in the HLPE Secretariat have just whispered into my ear, and they said that the online consultation is open. The report has been posted, and a link will be posted on chat and on the relevant websites and shared with all participants so that you can provide inputs into this. The next segment will have us hearing a bit from colleagues from UN agencies, and I will start with Benjamin Davis, who is the Director of Inclusive Rural Transformation and Gender Equality with FAO. Ben Davis, the floor is yours.
Great. No, thank you very much for giving me the chance to speak, and thank you very much, Professor, for the presentation. I think at FAO we share very much the idea that inequality and addressing inequality is central to achieving the SDGs, as well as to achieving sustainable and resilient agri-food systems over time. It's fundamental. And we also very much agree with the focus on the multiple dimensions of inequality, their intersectionality, how they overlap and how they feed on each other, and you can't just focus on them one by one. And so we very much share that. We also very much share the focus on systemic drivers and the root causes. A few things that I would add perhaps would be, one, I think, is the experience of COVID, and COVID has underscored and highlighted, has exposed inequality and the implications of inequality, I think, in a way that we could never do, with a report or any, just in real time. It was bared before our eyes. No? It also exacerbated inequality. And I think this increased inequality is very much going to weaken the recovery from COVID, an economic recovery from the other multiple crises that the world is facing. And it's going to leave basically those who have suffered the most from COVID and other crises on a lower development path into the future unless steps are taken, right? So the impact is long-term, and it's worse because of inequality. I think in order to address it, policies need to be explicit. We cannot rely just on economic growth to address, to resolve inequality, not even economic inequality, not even inequality in incomes, right? So I think policy needs to be explicit. We can't just depend on the process of development, let's say. A few other points I wanted to make, and perhaps this is in the report, which I haven't had a chance to read. I think it's also important to stress that not everything is increasingly unequal over time across all these dimensions that were mentioned. I mean, there have been some improvements over the past few years and in past few decades. Inequality is not the same everywhere, right? It varies over time and space. So there's not an unambiguous worsening of inequality everywhere. And I think this is important when looking for solutions and how we're addressing it and what is the experience of different countries, different contexts in terms of how inequality has been addressed and not been addressed at the micro, household, community, regional level, as well between countries. Okay, so it's certainly not unambiguous worsening everywhere. I also think it's important to look at it in a dynamic context, right? This is within processes of economic transformation, structural transformation, agriculture and rural transformation. It's a historical process, and so I think it's important to keep the history in mind of decrease in inequality over many domains, then increases as a result of public policy and other increases. And so I think keeping history in mind allows us to see the importance of policy, basically, and the kind of policies that are important over some of the dimensions, let's say. So what have been historical drivers of increasing as well as decreasing inequality in the past over time? I think it'll be important to also prioritize or at least suggest what might be the biggest bang for the buck over some of these dimensions of equality, because not everything, again, is equal. Some of the actions are much more complicated, they're much longer time, they're changing social norms, which have a whole different pace and space, let's say, to the distribution of assets or tax policy, all of these things. And so I think that's important to stress as well. There was any mention here, though I'm sure there is in the report, in terms of labor and labor markets and the assets that are important in terms of inequalities in labor markets. And again, the focus on the key assets, those assets that are most important, and those are basically those that are held by the poor, right? So whether it's land or whether it's human capital, basically, and the importance of getting those basic assets equalized. And then finally, just as I was listening to the presentation on the transformative actions, indeed those are transformative actions, but I feel as though some of those are really long-term, super long-term transformative actions. And I think other things where some kinds of redistribution of assets or even a fundamental tax reform can be extremely transformative. And so I think it's important to focus on, let's say, transformative actions that aren't just about, the issue of social norms, what have you, is also very important, but also focusing on assets and hard assets and the transformational nature of really redistributing those assets. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ben, for those remarks and for you and FAO's continued support to CFS. We're really grateful, and we look forward to continue working with you in this process, both in the report and the policy work that will follow thereafter. Before we go to the next speaker, I would like to remind you all that in the next couple of minutes, we'll be coming to you for your remarks. I've seen a couple of questions starting to pop up on chat, so if you want to post them there, please do. You have an opportunity to raise your hands and ask questions both online and in the room. But before then, let's hear from Dorothy Ngajilo, who is a consultant on occupational and workplace health at the World Health Organization. Dorothy, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours for your reflections.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute on this important topic on behalf of the World Health Organization. And as we discuss reducing inequalities for food security and nutrition, one thing I would also like to think about is the human cost of food production, not just focus on accessibility or safety of food, but also to consider the working conditions of those who produce food. So the agriculture industry is known to be one of the most dangerous sectors in terms of work-related fatalities, non-fatal accidents, and as well as occupational diseases. And some of the occupational health hazards that are facing agricultural workers include exposure to biological hazards, including zoonotic diseases acquired from animals. There's overuse of antibiotics in animals that lead to resistance of treatment for infectious diseases in humans, exposure to agrochemicals such as pesticides and fertilizers, high-level dust which are associated with respiratory diseases, safety hazards like working from heights, injury from operating farm equipment, motorized vehicles, economic hazards in agriculture from working for long hours in awkward postures, performing repetitive tasks and manual materials handling, which are associated with musculoskeletal disorders, physical hazards, extreme heat and cold conditions associated with outdoor work, which are made worse by climate change. And this increases the risk of heat stroke, frostbite, or hypothermia. There's stresses associated with environmental factors such as drought, floods, which again are connected to climate change, wildfire, pest diseases, which are affecting crops, but also long working hours, financial concerns, feeling isolation and frustrated, particularly for those who work in remote areas or migrant workers who work away from their families. So with this in mind, it is important to ensure healthy and safe working conditions for all agricultural workers, but also to ensure that these workers are covered by competent occupational health services. And at the moment, this is lacking in many, in the majority of the agricultural communities. We should also think of the safety and health of vulnerable workers, such as migrant workers who work in precarious jobs in difficult and dangerous conditions, and these result in adverse physical and mental health outcomes. But also to think about ways to eliminate child labor in agriculture, and this is considering that over 60% of all child labor globally occurs in the agriculture industry. And majority of these child laborers are family members who work without formal contracts and may not even be paid. So this is something also to think about. And in June this year, the International Labour Conference of the International Labour Organization decided to include a health and safe working environment as a fundamental principle and right at work. And this must be ensured also in the food production industry as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dorothy, for bringing into the room the voice and concerns of those who deliver food to us, the food workers. And I think that's an important angle to look at. I believe Professor Shankar and his team are taking notes. Probably they already had it covered in the report. And as we conclude that segment, I'll now invite you in the room to pose any questions. I'm looking around to see whether there's a hand up specifically on the report or any item we would want to cover. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Florence Segal from UN Habitat. Thank you. It's very nice to hear all the work that's happening, in particular the attention that's given to decent work of all food workers. It was also very interesting to hear WHO's presentation. WHO used to work a lot on socio-economic determinants of health, and maybe that would be also an element that would be relevant to the report. Of course, I would say smallholder farmers, of course, women in rural areas, of course, but being from UN Habitat, I would say we have a lot of people in urban slums that are suffering from inequalities really, and having negative impact on food security and nutrition. So leaving no one behind is extremely important to our organization, and we certainly hope to see how best to contribute to the report. It's very important that we look at the drivers in the present food systems, which are already quite responsible for a lot of the inequalities. It was nice to hear also reference to the legal dimensions. A lot of the norms we presently have are actually drivers of inequalities because, in particular, people in the informal sector are not necessarily in the conditions to fit with those norms that may need to be adapted sometime. It's important to see how the food system can limit inequalities, but it would be also important to see who else is working on inequalities and how the food system can help these people. because very often we find out that, for example, migrants who were not necessarily involved in food at all, it is their first port of call when they need to get a job. So I think it's important to see both ways. How can we have a more fair food system, but also how can food and agriculture contribute to a more fair development system? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florence, for those remarks, and now CJR.
Thank you. This is a hugely important topic, and it confronts fundamental challenges and weaknesses of society and human nature. I was impressed by Ben Davis's comment that many of the transformative actions are super long term. And my concern, I have to say, by the way, I'm representing the advisory group of the CFS, Rod Cook, and as the chair said, HLP reports the next stage is policy convergence. And my concern, first of all, let me thank Professor Shankar for an excellent presentation of Reducing Inequalities. And in the title, I see for food security and nutrition is in smaller font. This is a problem when we come to policy convergence, that frequently the advisory groups supporting the member states' bureau struggle with the fact that the HLP report, by its very nature, correctly, confronts a very broad range of issues. And many of the member states come back saying, but this is beyond the scope of food security and nutrition. So my first point to Professor Shankar is to please try and focus as far as possible on the problem space and the solution space for food security and nutrition to minimize that problem for the next stage. The second point, I noted, Professor Shankar, you mentioned a couple of HLP reports. And many of us in the advisory group perceive that all of the HLP reports are excellent, but often they come to us as almost freestanding reports. In other words, they could maybe benefit more from some of the preceding HLP reports, which focus tightly on food security and nutrition, and indeed some of the reports of the many other organizations that are looking at inequalities. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Rodney, for those really deep reflections, and I believe Professor Shankar will speak to those. I don't see any more hands in the room, and as we wait, I will read out a question that was posed by Barbara Van Passen online, and she says, is whether the team, Professor Shankar and your team, whether you're looking at the risks and opportunities of some current trends and crises in addressing inequalities. For example, she says, food costs, challenges to multilateralism, shrinking civic space, COVID, economic impacts, policy responses, etc., whether those are covered in the scope of work you're doing. And she follows up with another question and says, wealth inequality is one of the fastest growing inequalities, with lots of links to food systems that could be interesting to understand better. And I know later on during the panel discussion, we have a speaker who will probably touch a bit on this. But Prof, I wonder whether that's something that we want to look at. And I understand there's one hand up online, but before we go to the person who has raised their hand, I will give the floor to Professor Shankar to respond to some of the issues that have come up. Prof, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. In response to Barbara's very good comment, in fact, Barbara and I have just been having a direct message exchange, just following up on exactly this point. Just to clarify that some of these issues, like, for example, the shrinking civic space, things like food prices, cost of living, multilateralism, we do touch upon this. As I said to Barbara, I don't know whether we've done it enough justice yet. But very happy after you read the report if you tell us we must strengthen this aspect or that aspect. I know that the team is very strong on many of these aspects particularly and would be glad to engage with them. So points all well taken, some of which are addressed, some of which may need more elaboration, but agree with those. And just in response, I think there have been several comments, and these all look very valid comments to me, and we will go back, take it back to the team, reflect upon all of these comments, think about how we can best engage with them. But of course, there will be lots and lots more comments coming in as the actual consultation goes ahead. So we will certainly take a strong look at everything that's been said so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And now we'll give the floor to Ali Mohammed Kamara, who is online for his question. Kamara?
Oui, bonjour. Merci encore.
Good morning. I would like to be part of the discussion that we're having on inequalities, social, cultural, and other types of policies having an effect on food security and inclusion. In fact, there are two issues I'd like to briefly comment upon. The issue pertaining to the work of men and women according to where they live. In countries such as Senegal, in the south of the country, where work is shared between men and women. Generally, rice production occurs in flooded areas, for instance, which means that the fact that people stay in these flooded areas for a certain amount of time, at a certain point in time after 40 years of age or so, they are affected by rheumatism and so on. And this is a fact that has been seen for some years now, and it's linked to the age of these rice paddy workers, and women often have mobility issues after the age of 40. But sometimes other issues affect the situation as well. For instance, most of the time, if you look at the warehouses or storehouses, they are being filled by the work of women, but from a consumption point of view, it's the whole family that benefits, to the detriment of the work done by men, which is done in other areas. For instance, you have different types of cash crops and so on, which will enable you to buy extra food or clothing. But most of the household's consumption is based on those types of income or revenue. So what's going to happen in times when food is lacking? People are asked, well, there's less food to be eaten, and there are girls and boys, and some are going to receive more food. And very often, the obvious choice goes towards the boys. Why? Well, there are all kinds of reasons that are given, but the first is that the boy is supposed to continue the family line, and secondly, the girl will at some point leave the household, the family household, to go to her future husband's household. And so it's girls who are more likely to die of hunger than the boys, simply because the boys are the ones who get fed most because they are supposed to continue the family line. And when we made these types of surveys, it was really surprising to see the types of answers that we were given. So access to food between girls and boys depends on things like that. And these are very important issues. I think we have to put these problems on the table to see with Professor Shankar whether this is something that can be found in other areas of the world, for instance. So could the report actually deal with those types of issues to see how we can actually improve living conditions and the working conditions of various categories? With regards to women working in flooded areas with their feet in the water for long periods of time, obviously an improvement of their working conditions in the flooded areas would mean, of course, would require technological improvements. And, of course, we might be able to use motorized implements. And are there any international organizations who fund the purchase of those types of equipment? And is there any way that we could actually deal with these types of instances in order to improve the working conditions of these women working in paddy fields? And very often, when we focus on these types of categories, we see that these people suffering from food insecurity, they exist. We know of them. So how can we make sure that these people are helped directly, supported, even within a program? But how can we make sure?
Your intervention, please.
Yes, of course. These were the types of issues I wanted to deal with. How can we really help these people to get over these very precarious types of situations that they live in and make sure that their living conditions are improved? Thank you.
Merci, and many thanks for bringing to the floor very, very tangible examples from your experience in Senegal. And I believe that Professor Shankar and his team are looking at some, if not all, of the issues that you have mentioned. I'll have one final question before we give the floor to Professor to make his final remarks, and this has come from Zoltan online. I know he was responding to the presentation by Ben Davis, who has had to step out. And the question is, or the reflection is, that economic growth sometimes in itself cannot adequately address inequalities. Economic growth in itself cannot adequately address inequalities. Adds that sometimes it actually aggravates the situation. Are you looking into this, Prof, even as you respond to the other question from Senegal? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, we do have some discussion of the links between economic growth, poverty reduction, and inequalities. There's been some work on that, including some work coming out of FAO, which we've engaged with. I do think probably listening to the comments today and certainly the comments that have come up on this aspect, that we perhaps need to go back and strengthen that and consider more results. I know there are other people in this meeting also who have some valuable recent work that they can potentially contribute to these kinds of areas. So we will be very happy to go back and look at that. But there is some engagement with it, but we very possibly have to do more. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. And we'll now let you and your team continue focusing and listening in on the next phase of the discussion as you gather insights on what's coming across from this intersessional event. And before we move to the next segment, I understand that colleagues from the high-level panel of experts Secretariat would want to briefly make an intervention, especially on the next steps, including the e-consultation that has already opened. I'm checking whether they are ready with this, or should I proceed to the next level? Evariste, is it set? All right, I see the slides are up.
This is Sylvia from the HLPE-FSN Secretariat. I just shared the slides, as you can see. Do you want me to present them very quickly?
Yes, please go ahead, Sylvia.
All right. Well, then, as we shared in the chat, the e-consultation is already online. It is part of the process of elaboration of the report. And we seek input, suggestions, and comments, and we use the platform of the Global Forum on Food Security and Nutrition, the FSN Forum, which is an open, neutral platform for a multi-stakeholder dialogue facilitated by the FAO Agri-Food Economic Division, and it engages with a wide range of individuals and institutions. So this is the platform we use. It's in French, Spanish, and English. So please feel free to write in these languages. And now my PowerPoint just froze. Oh. All right. So as it was said, the e-consultations are a key part of the inclusive and knowledge-based dialogue between the HLPE-FSN steering committee and the knowledge community at large. And as you can see, the V0 draft is already online. You can read it. It's presented early enough in the process as work in progress. It's a draft with imperfections to allow sufficient time to properly consider the feedbacks received in the elaboration of the report. And just the last slide, it's just the link, but you have it in the chat. I can put it again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for sharing about the e-consultations that has just opened. And this means that there's an opportunity for all participants here and other people who are interested in this topic, which I believe all of us who care about food security and nutrition should be interested in. Please disseminate it as widely as you can to your colleagues and to within your networks, so that Professor Shankar and his team can benefit from a rich variety of inputs. We'll now transition to the next and final phase of our event today, which is a panel discussion. As we do this, I'm really pleased to introduce to you our four panelists, and I will present them to you in the order that they will speak in. First off, we have Dr. Agnes Quisumbing, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. Next is Matthew Fisher-Post, who is a Research Fellow at the Paris School of Economics with the World Inequality Lab. We then have Ms. Saima Zia, who is a Women's Secretary and Central Committee member of the Pakistan Kissan Rabita Committee, and she'll be speaking on behalf of the CFS, Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, CSIPM, Working Group on Inequalities. And last, and in no way least, we will hear from Ms. Megha Desai, who is representing the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, and she'll be speaking for and on behalf of the CFS private sector mechanism. Each panelist will make a brief presentation, again, to try and answer the questions that we have put out, and to share their own experiences, the work that they're doing, the inequalities they're seeing, policy opportunities that they are interacting with that we should be making use of, and more importantly, provide inputs that the HLPE project team can tap into. After their presentations, we will again have another round of interactions, questions, comments, and this is broader. It's not restricted to the report, so we once again invite you to make your comments, request the floor, post your questions on chat, and we'll give you the floor. And so without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Quisumbing for her remarks, and she will be focusing on inequalities through a food systems lens. Dr. Quisumbing, what are you saying? Share with us, please.
Thank you so much, Chair, and good day, good afternoon, good morning to Your Excellencies and colleagues. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. So I am going to talk today about inequality through a gendered food system lens. Not just a food system lens, but a food system lens with a particular focus on gender. And I'm using a framework which was developed by Jemima Njuki and colleagues, including myself, for the Global Food Systems Summit last year. And the reason that I decided to use this lens is partly because most of my work has been on gender, but also because gender inequalities are among the structural inequalities that permeate the food system. So the food systems framework, the gendered food system framework, is a very comprehensive framework. And what are the key components? The key components are that food system drivers are anchored in a gendered social, political, institutional, and economic system, which has structural gender inequalities. This is what you have on top. These drivers, in turn, influence the three main components of food systems, the blue boxes of value chains, food environments, and consumer behavior, as well as their outcomes. These are the purple boxes on the right. The three components of the food system interact with gender inequality in a four-dimensional space, the sort of the grayish boxes on the bottom left, which consists of individual, systemic, formal, and informal factors. So if you can see that gender inequality permeates the food system, it means that transforming food systems in equitable ways requires changes in gender equality at all levels. So for example, changes in women's agency, differences in access to and control over resources, gendered social norms, and existing policies and governance influence how men and women can participate and benefit from food systems, thereby leading to differences in overall outcomes. But one thing we've learned in many years of programming and interventions working with women is that individual changes are not enough to transform food systems. What we want to say is that don't fix women, fix the system. Changes in deep-seated structures and implicit social and cultural norms have to take place because these underpin the way institutions operate, often in invisible ways. And finally, formal policies, laws, and institutional arrangements, which are both formal and systemic, are critical to protect against social and gender discrimination and to advance equality. Change has to go beyond reaching women through interventions and to facilitate the empowerment process so that women can benefit from food system activities by increasing their well-being, food security, income, and health, and can make and act upon strategic life decisions within food systems. Now, so you might ask, this is very nice, well and good, it's very theoretical. What does this actually mean empirically? And I don't know whether you can see the bottom, unfortunately, because of this bar from Zoom. So I'm going to walk you through it. So what we did is we took some very large data sets from Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nepal, Ghana, Mozambique, and Tanzania, and tried to decompose the contribution of inter-household gender inequality to food and nutrition outcomes. We use a Shapley decomposition. And we measure inter-household gender inequality by looking at the difference between men's and women's empowerment scores. These empowerment scores were computed using the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or the WEA, and it's based on individual data from like thousands of households which were interviewed. We analyzed a whole set of outcomes related to household food security, dietary diversity of the household and of women, child anthropometric status, women's anthropometric status. But for the purpose of this brief intervention, because we don't have time, I'm going to look only at the variance of household dietary diversity. And unfortunately, because of Zoom, you can't the bar, you can't see the chart. But if you look at this very thin slice, very tiny green slice between the blue and the aqua-colored slice, what you'll see here is that that one is a contribution of inter-household inequality to the variance in household diversity. The biggest contribution actually comes from wealth, which is the purple one, and this blue one on the upper left, which is country-specific factors. The aqua is household demographics. The red one is whether or not women have primary schooling, and the orange one is whether men have primary schooling. So all in all, the fact that wealth is the biggest contribution to variance means that you can't eliminate inequalities in food security outcomes by eliminating empowerment gaps alone. I mean, gender equality is highly correlated to many positive food systems outcomes. But the structural inequalities that underlie the food system, like wealth inequality, is still the biggest contributor to the variance, and wealth inequality intersects and interacts with other aspects of inequality, like gender inequality. So I guess I would end with the point that it's important to tackle gender inequality, but let's not forget that wealth inequality interacts and reinforces gender inequality, and tackling both of this is challenging and crucial to solving food and nutrition insecurity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Quisumbing, for those remarks, and especially giving it a bit of a gendered lens, which we know is critical in achieving food security and nutrition. Now we'll go to Matthew. And Matthew, I know you said, and we have seen some of the messages you going to share, which is quite fascinating. And the question is, what kind of income and wealth inequalities do we see in agricultural development? I think those questions had started coming through in the first segment. And as a follow-on to that is, do we have enough research and data to understand these inequalities, or do we need a rethink of how we conduct research? So Matthew, the floor is yours to share with us a bit more about the work that you're doing and that might benefit the project team.
Thank you. And I'm happy to join you today in this interesting and important work, and to tell you about a seed project we've started at the World Inequality Lab. And so the background of this project and the preliminary steps and some next steps, I want to ask and think about some ways that it can feed into the CFS high-level panel of experts agenda and beyond. And so your questions and suggestions are welcome. And I'm happy to be a part of this discussion. So I actually wanted to start with an image that might dovetail nicely into Dr. Quisumbing's presentation to illustrate some of those points. And this is the probability of encountering a female-headed household along the rural income distribution in developing countries across 3 continents where our survey data touches. And so this data should be interpreted with care, and we can get to that, but it gives some flavor to show what we can do with good data and the importance of identifying vulnerable populations and the types of characteristics that can differ along the income distribution. And I'd like to argue that when we think about inequality, we should think first about the income distribution. And I guess I would emphasize, so obviously the multidimensional perspectives that have been raised today are important, but I would emphasize the importance of first looking at the income distribution in contrast to the distribution of consumption or of food consumption or other types of consumption. Just in this graph, we see the ratio of consumption to income along the same distribution of rural households. And if we think about what this shows is that poor rural people are going to extraordinary lengths to meet their basic needs and rely extensively on private and public transfers. remittances, family, friends, wire transfer, social insurance, and social assistance, even beyond what they earn in a market incomes perspective. And so if we're only looking at consumption or expenditure, then we're vastly underestimating inequality. And so that's sort of the background of this project, that this research on inequality in agricultural development. And I think there's probably more sources than could be named for the inspirations in this line of research. And there's a long tradition in the agricultural economics literature. But there's a few things that we think we know, and perhaps the chief among these is that growth in the agriculture sector is generally pro-poor, and that structural change out of agriculture can be inequality increasing in the short term, but inequality reducing in the long term. And it turns out that even these things that we think we know maybe are not so simple. So it's important to return to these basic foundational questions with new data for a fresh perspective. And particularly to ask when and why and under what conditions would growth in the agriculture sector or structural change out of agriculture, to the extent that these two things are different, when would it be pro-poor versus when would it be inequality increased? So these are our research questions in a broad heading. Just inequality during the process of agricultural development and the public policy options to approach this. And from that lineage on where the research is coming from, we wanted to see what the state of the art in today's data can tell us, including new survey microdata and macroeconomic aggregates for new estimates of inequality dynamics. And in macroeconomic data, we want to know the overall picture of agricultural value added in GDP, of the agricultural labor force, the types of statistics that FAOstat can tell us. But the interesting contribution might come from studying distributional dynamics in survey microdata. And so we'll get to that in the next slides. But on that note, here are some of the biggest picture items. We know that agricultural employment declines with development, and that's true both in cross-section and cross-country analysis, and even within a given country's long-run time series on development, at least for the developed countries. And this is as close as one would ever find it as an iron law in development. And on the other hand, we see that agriculture is less productive in the developing countries, where it is also most prominent. And that's true not only in absolute terms, that agriculture in developing countries is less productive per labor hour, if not per hectare, than developed countries, but also in a relative sense, that agriculture is less productive than other sectors in the same economy. And so I don't think it would surprise anyone in this room to argue that closing the agricultural productivity gap would go a long way toward rural poverty reduction, and that there may be a way to do it that is inequality reducing as well. So how does this relate to inequality? So if we take the same two variables from the previous slide, looking at the agricultural share of the labor force and the agricultural productivity gap with respect to non-agricultural employment, and if we relate them to overall national income inequality, we do see some suggestive evidence that indeed places with more agricultural laborers and less productive agriculture also have higher inequality. But if this is true in cross-section, do we also observe this in the same country over time? And that's where the work becomes more difficult. And so in this example for Kenya, in macroeconomic statistics, we can track long-run trends over time, including a decreasing share of the labor force in agriculture, simultaneous with an increase in agricultural value added. But these dynamics are not particularly visible in the aggregate per capita income statistics, and maybe we see a decline in the overall national income inequality. And similar stories can be told in other countries, but the point is that we don't necessarily have great data on the distribution of incomes over time, and in turn, the distributional incidence of any agricultural productivity shifts. And so for tractability on income distributions in the agricultural sector and overall, we turned to the universe of ILO microdata surveys that ILO shared with us for the purpose of this study, where they compiled and harmonized over 1,000 country years of over 130 countries of labor force surveys. And so at first, it seems we can answer this question and say that inequality within the agriculture sector is proportional to inequality overall. But there's probably at least two things to note here. And the first is that to say that income inequality within the agricultural sector is similar to inequality overall is not to say that incomes are the same, only that the shape of the distribution is the same. And here we see that the median income in agriculture is usually between 60 and 70% of the median income outside of agriculture. But more than that, how much can we actually learn from those 1,000 years of labor force surveys over 100 countries? And the answer is less than one would like. In fact, when we compare the ILO results to what has to be considered a higher quality data source, and that's the FAO Rural Livelihoods Information System. These are the same countries and usually the same year, taken from two different data sources, one being a labor force survey and the other being a household income survey. And so you would expect or hope that the two would give similar results for the agricultural income distribution. And if they did, we would observe all of the observations along the 45-degree line, because the Gini coefficient estimate would be the same in both sources. And as you can see, these observations are very far from the 45-degree line, which is to say that the sources are very different. The estimates from these sources are very different. And so the point is that measuring agricultural income and household income, much less individual income, is very difficult. The first place to start might be that we would prefer a 12-month to a 30-day recall, and that's the difference between a household survey and a labor force survey. But more important is the measurement of agricultural income itself. And labor force surveys notably measure agricultural income poorly when they measure it, and they're frequently restricted to salaried and wage employment, but not to household enterprises. And so here, if we take only the FAO source, which is both LSMS, ISA, and data that has been harmonized in the spirit of LSMS, ISA, if we look at the previous definition, what we can call the ILO definition, studying strictly salaried and wage employment on the y-axis, and the comprehensive agricultural household income definition on the x-axis, including all sources of agricultural income, we see that inequality increases almost mechanically, in the sense that agricultural income earners can have diversified livelihoods, and so we find more information on those at the bottom of the income distribution, and we find more people, and we find more information about those at the top of the distribution, and so with better data and better measurement, our sense of inequality even increases. So if we revise the earlier picture with better data on agricultural versus overall inequality, we see that there's maybe not the same trend we had earlier observed, and maybe in Africa, agricultural inequality, strictly within the agriculture sector, is not as high as inequality overall, and yet it's higher than both agricultural and overall inequality in other countries, which is to say that we might be observing a Kuznets-style process where inequality among poor people is low, but what is clear is that better data adds more nuance to the earlier picture, and the story might become more complicated. So I just want to leave you with, if we return to where we started, on the role of agriculture in overall inequality, but now with better data, we see that, for example, even in Asia, agriculture is the most important income source for the poorest people. And so green represents on-farm household agricultural income, brown is agricultural wage and salaried employment, yellow is self-employment, and orange is off-farm salaried employment, blue is social protection. And this role of agriculture is even more remarkable in Africa, where agricultural income dominates for the poorest 70% of the population, and social protection is very limited. So if we zoom in particularly on the agriculture sector, in Africa, the on-farm share of income is obviously the most important. And agricultural wage labor becomes a marker of higher earnings in the sector, but it's relatively rare. So to close, if there's a single best large-scale policy prescription for reducing inequality and dealing immediately with poverty, it would have to be those under the heading of social protection. Here we see the coverage and incidence of social insurance policies. In the next slide, I'll show social assistance, but this is mostly old age pensions and unemployment insurance, and we see that they are largely missing the agricultural population. In Asia, the result is mostly driven by India, as these results are population weighted. And imagine that this is the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, but in other countries, this can be particularly regressive. So people can frequently not access social security schemes unless they have a formal sector job. And so in any case, the coverage here is very low, and the percentage of household income similarly low. And for social assistance, it's a similar story, but there's perhaps a particularly interesting pattern for Latin America, in which many Latin American countries, or at least those for which we have survey microdata, there's widespread social assistance programs. And so if you think of the Procampo or Oportunidades programs in Mexico, these actually have relatively solid coverage. But in Africa, it's much less so. And so even if up to 10% of the population might be covered by social assistance, and you see that it's regressive, that coverage actually increases with income, the magnitude of the social protection itself is very low, and that it hardly makes a dent in the income of those for whom we would say that they need it most. And so to conclude, obviously further research can be done here, but I think the question of specific fiscal policies and large-scale support, the most vulnerable populations, based on precise data collection and analysis is the most urgent question we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that comprehensive presentation. Kept track of the graphs and numbers, and it paints a very vivid picture. I'll now move to our next speaker, but even as I do that, just to make a comment, I think, Rodney, you kicked off a very interesting debate that's going on online with your comment, and we'll have a moment to come to that at the end of the presentations by the panelists. Just that reference you made about the framing of the discussions around the HLPE reports. But before we get to that, we have two more speakers. We have now Saima Zia joining us from Pakistan, and Saima will share with us a bit of examples of intersectional policy pathways to reduce inequalities. Saima, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. As you know, my name is Saima, and I'm representing Pakistan Kissan Rabita Committee and International Peasant Movement Lavia Company Sena. First of all, the CSIPM would like to thank the CFS Chair and CFS Secretariat for convening this event on reducing inequalities. The CFS must continue listening to the voices of those most affected by food insecurity and malnutrition. However, it is not enough for member states to simply hear what we have to say. Multilateral and concrete policy action is urgently needed in response to our proposals and demands. The HLPE has made it abundantly clear to the CFS that the status quo is no longer an option. Realizing the right to food requires critical policy shift and radical transformation of food system focused primarily on equity and sustainability. Today, we want to underscore why intersectionality is fundamental to consider when developing policy approaches and finding entry points to reduce and eliminate inequalities. Inequalities within and beyond the food systems have been an integral part of colonial domain and capitalism. The growing corporate concentration, increasing debt, tax evasion, austerity measures, and dependency on food imports are a testimony of this colonial system prone to crisis. With the lingering consequences of the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine, there is little no room for countries to cope with increasing food and fuel prices, volatile commodity markets, and financial speculation. The devastating impacts of COVID-19, the destructive consequences the climate change is having on the most vulnerable communities, not only in my country, but all around the world, are closely linked to the economic, social, and environmental injustices provoked by neoliberal policies and the food system based off intensive export-oriented agriculture production, global supply chains, and market-led food provision. During the COVID-19 crisis, communities' responses have fostered values of solidarity, resilience, sustainability, and human dignity. However, in contrast, government policies and financial support have mostly favored corporations, large producers, and global supply chain, ensuring them the capital and workforce they need to keep operations running. This came at the expense of local food system, creating hardships and deepening food insecurities. Intersectionality required us to adopt a particular approach and consider the different ways in which the current food system systematically disadvantages, impoverishes, and marginalized women and general diverse people, youth, indigenous people, people with disabilities, older workers, migrants, refugees, racialized people, people who live and work in rural areas, and other such groups. Also, we would like to point out that the many measures and policies already exist to reduce inequalities, which we need to think about that. The GGTTs and UNDROP and UN drop and UN rape are the examples of inclusive, intersectional, and human rights-based policies and tangible demands from the peasant movements and agriculture workers, fisherfolk, and pastoralists. But until recently, they have not been brought together in any intersectional manner, unfortunately, at global policy level. The workstream on inequalities offers us the opportunity to create coherence between all the CFS policy instruments, especially seeking complementarities with the workstream on gender and youth. The UN agencies have also delivered, the other UN agencies also delivered valuable work on reducing inequalities. For example, UN-raised flagship report, which has just launched and came up here at the beginning of the November, that pointed out that the current crisis is not the flaw in the system, but a feature of it. So we can't just green the system with ad hoc policies. We need large-scale systematic change with paradigm shift. The CSIPM strongly advocate for universal social protection policies to support families and communities who face the increase in prices and which truly address inequalities. Social and solidarity economies can address many of the symptoms and root causes in our failing food systems. We are not only speaking about like a topic or unfeasible measures. There are already existing examples of policy framework that are human rights based, equitable, and based on social justice. They just need to be upscaled, support, and overall implementation. Think about Bolsa Familia, introduced in Brazil in 2007, food safety-based income, build on linking local agroecological and organic small-scale localized food production for school meals, and a strong Ministry of Solidarity Economy as well as Ministry for Smallholder Farmers, proved to ensure an intersectional approach to the right to food, including both indigenous producers and consumers. Several CSO groups in Europe and beyond are today calling for measures of food social protection because it makes sense. If peasant and rural workers receive decent pay and earn an acceptable living wage at their hometowns, they can afford to buy healthy food, pay their energy bills, access their workplace, and less forced to leave rural areas and become the part of the urban poor. Next to measures of social and solidarity economies, we need to distribute power, which means putting a halt to harmful policies and practices, which is very important. This is the third food price crisis in the 15 years. So it indicates to show how fragile global food markets are and how prices are largely determined by the unsustainable demand, depends on, and concentration of power in the global supply chain. So I just, dear friends and colleagues, I just want to conclude this all at the last, that conclusion is tackling inequality is required making political and ethical decisions now and in the future too. And we strongly hope that the HLPE report by itself and through the subsequent CFS policies convergent process can significantly contribute to overcoming inequalities for food justice and healthy, sustainable food system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Saima, for offering those reflections, not only from your experience in the work you're doing in Pakistan, but a consolidation of the work that you're driving within the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanisms working group on inequalities. I'll now move to our last panelist, and as I said earlier, in Norway list, and this is Megha Desai. And Megha, I apologize for mischaracterizing your affiliation earlier, and your correction is well noted. You'll be representing voices of informal sector workers. And so my question to you, Megha, is, given the work that you do with SEWA, do you have some insights to share with us about research and data on these informal workers that you represent?
Thank you. Excellencies, Ambassador, distinguished guests, fellow panelists, and your participants. Namaste, good morning and afternoon. Thank you for giving us opportunity to bring out the very urgent need of informal sector women workers about data and evidences. Data is an emerging important tool as we've seen in organizing poor women and help them to support them to come out of poverty. Women of informal sector struggle for the visibility in spite of working hard and toiling to grow a food or earn income. The informal sector workers struggle, and while we talk about gender inequality and gender justice and strengthening food system, the role of women, the recognition of women as worker and policies to strengthen their trades needs data of informal sector women workers, the contributions and their situation. The need for data has been clearly realized and validated by the Global Commission on Future of Work of ILO, and more recently, the UN Food System Summit. And even more so, the pandemic has shown us how to an extent this is possible. We at SEWA, who has organized 2.1 million women in Indian informal sector, works for the twin objective of full employment and self-reliance for our members. In the pursuit of 5 decades, SEWA has realized that data is a tool which can help women to bring out to mainstream and out of poverty. Even to ensure that the members achieve full employment, the integrated work data on their work security, income security, food security, nutrition security, and social security, including childcare and healthcare, are very vital. SEWA believes that poverty is worst kind of violence, and inaccessibilities which drive women out of decision-making processes along the food supply chains is also worst kind of violence. Thus, SEWA has developed tools by which the members themselves can measure their current status and, most importantly, qualitative and quantitative data, even on delicate subjects of gender-based violence and structural barriers, and help them to reaffirm that changes is possible. We also heard investment in human capital is vital. The World Bank Index mainly talks about the formal workers under the Human Capital Index. So SEWA has done research on what does human capital investment mean for informal sector women workers. Use of data has been a very important ingredient of organizing, which helps build agency of women. Today we have our own application called SEWA No Wordlo, which means SEWA's banyan tree, which gives us real-time data on renewal of membership, on their trades, on their income levels, and the government entitlements. It helps us in designing the programs and targeting. Since largest membership is from rural areas with the land-based activities, SEWA's goal for livelihood security calls for economic regeneration through ecological regeneration. And the banyan tree application provides us two-way flow of data, which helps to design programs based on the needs and demands of the members. In these 5 decades, SEWA has organized about 4,800 plus self-employed self-help groups, 160 cooperatives, and 15 economic federations, totaling to 2.1 million members, pan-India, including 18 states and 7 South Asian countries, focusing on women's economic empowerment by building women-owned enterprises, cooperatives, collectives, companies, federations, building women-led supply chains in energy, agribusiness, food processing, waste recycling, textile and garmenting. All these happened as we at SEWA feel that data has been a tool to increase the collective strength and bargaining power of women. During the COVID, SEWA has set up a war room to collect structural, qualitative as well as quantitative data about the economic losses faced by the informal sector women workers. This data helped various stakeholders to timely reach out to the need of affected families, be it health, be it livelihoods, food security, or repurposing the supply chain aspects, which helped stabilize the informal workers' livelihoods during the pandemic. SEWA runs agriculture campaign since 1995 and run a national network of farmers forum where we have organized 2 billion family farmers across India. Family farmers provides food to larger portion of the world. To address the challenges of hunger, we have taken approach of develop farm as enterprise and farmer as entrepreneur by putting small and marginal farmers at central stage, making them owners and managers of their own trade, making women visible as a farmer and custodian of the biodiversity and food system. And to make this happen, two-way data collection and communication, analysis, knowledge transfer, help to make it happen through the various surveys and various participatory tools. SEWA has also gathered data around supply chains of the agriculture commodities with an objective to form agribusiness plans for investment. A market app of Rudi Sandesha Vyavhar for illiterate or semi-literate farmers and processors, and participatory tools and modules for agri-supply chains has been developed, which is currently being used by the members. We have worked with over 7,000 plus informal sector women workers to help achieve an appropriate shift towards environment sustainability, decent work, just transition, reducing poverty and gender inequality, and building resilience. We support salt pan workers with solar pumps and energy efficient equipments for the home and workplace. All thanks to data that helps SEWA to reach to carbon market and make the equipments affordable to the members. SEWA believes that data-based decision will help in bringing informal sector women workers visible in climate adaptation and inform the policymakers as a movement transformers. These data-based decisions and data-backed solutions will help SEWA move forward its 50 years of resolution to build cleaner sky, cleaner air, and cleaner water, solidarity, and sisterhood through climate action. SEWA's data gathering tools are developed considering that informal sector members can gather data and the data can fetch them needed recognition through organized strength, the voices at the decision-making platforms, and validation of their work. Data is also a tool to build community resilience until we put data into hands of community, farmers, artisans, cattle breeders, dairy farmers, or weavers, and find how they use the data and they design their coping strategies. We are not building resilience to them. How do women own and create their own algorithms? Thus, SEWA strongly feels there is a need to invest in informal sector women workers organization to consolidate such data that is existing by investing not only in the consolidation, but encourage common ownership and easy access of such data, not by other stakeholders alone, but by women and workers, and jointly co-creating knowledge for data system by the poor women. This is what we call a bottom-up approach, bottom-up AI, which becomes a bargaining tools. And lastly, SEWA calls for the data of informal sector women in food system to bring out their current status, their needs, which can help policy makers to strengthen policies for food and nutrition security and strengthen food system. Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you very much, Megha, for bringing the voice of informal workers, especially the women you work with. And I was chatting on the side with Professor Shankar, and he says he and his team are taking notes. They have noted all the comments that have been made, and certainly these will be considered in the next step as they work on the report. I will now open the floor for interventions. I'm looking around the room to see if anyone wants to take the floor. There are a couple of questions on chat, which I can go to if no hands in the room. Rodney, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Again, I'm speaking, Rod Cook, for the advisory group of CFS representing the CGIR, the International Ag Research. So I was interested by Professor Fischer-Post's presentation on ag growth and inequalities. Unfortunately, his rather complex slides went very quickly, so I'm not sure I got all the benefit, but it left me thinking back to Gabriel, our chair's opening comments, where he said there were 3 key elements in inequality in FSN, and his first one was the role of smallholder farmers. And that driver, of course, was echoed there by Megha Desai in SEWA, with her comments about smallholder farmers. The reason I raised that, colleagues, is that there's an awful lot of thinking along those lines in the UN Decade of Family Farming, 2019 to 2028. Since, of course, smallholder farmers are central to inequalities, that plan, the UNDFF, has 7 pillars which respond in many respects, and I hope that the V0 of this HLPE has taken note of that. The second reference is, since we're sitting here in IFAD, is IFAD's Rural Development Report of last year, which had the title Transforming Food Systems for Rural Prosperity. A very thorough and very long report, which has an awful lot of useful stuff pertinent to the themes that Professor Shankar raised in his opening presentation. I also mentioned earlier HLPE reports. One that doesn't get much attention is HLPE-13 from 2018, which was the Multi-Stakeholder Partnerships report. That report, colleagues, focused on value chains or supply chains from farmers to consumers, and of course drew attention to the many sources of inequality. That document also took advantage of one of the CGIR background publications, a book called Innovation for Inclusive Value Chains. One of the lead authors there is, of course, Maximo Torero, who's now with us in FAO. A final comment is that the CGIR has recast its strategy for its research portfolio based on a number of initiatives, all of which are on the CGIR website, but one of them, well, there's several actually who have direct bearing on this inequalities topic in the system transformation grouping, but I'll just mention one, which is entitled Rethinking Food Markets and Value Chains for Inclusion and Sustainability. A lot of background there, which I hope Professor Shankar's colleagues have had a chance to look at, which may well help in taking forward V0. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodney, again for, as usual, very deep and insightful inputs and remarks. And I'm not sure whether Prof wants to take the floor. I think he is more keen to ensure that he's capturing as many of these nuggets as he can. So I'll go to Florence here in the room before we pose some of the questions posted on chat. Florence, please.
Thank you very much. My question was just, I haven't read the report, and I'm looking forward to read it. I was interested to know whether the team had looked at traditional solidarity networks. I was very struck in a previous meeting of CFS a few years ago by somebody from Costa Rica telling us, look, before there was no food insecurity in our village. If a woman lost her husband, if there was something wrong, whatever, the community would find a way to help that family. These systems have been eroded and do not fit with the present economic model. And I was wondering whether it would not be a good idea to revisit some of those, including coping mechanism in case of crisis, etc., to see if anything in there would be worth building upon or reviving. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. Prof, sounds like we will have to come to you at some point, but before then, checking if anyone else in the room wants to take the floor. If none, I have a couple of questions posted on chat, and I will read those. And just to allow you time, Professor Shankar, to get ready. Judith Hitchman has driven a very interesting discussion on chat, and then she posted she wasn't in a very good shape, so I would have given you the floor, Judith. If you can't take the floor, and if you can hear me, do you want to speak? If not, I will summarize some of the questions you have posted, and the most recent one is in response to the presentation by Saima, and it's on social protection systems. And she says, can and need to include a food safety net too? And then she says, as was the case, and hopefully again soon in Brazil. And she says the zero form and the Familiar in Brazil was the best model so far. But many developed countries are also talking about a full social protection in terms of the current food crisis. So really interesting discussion there. There's a comment. I don't know whether Saima, you want to come in at some point and elaborate on that or speak to that. And there's a question to Dorothy at the World Health Organization. And Dorothy, the reference that Judith made was to the International Labour Organization's conference in June on social solidarity, economy, and decent work. So you probably, Dorothy, might want to come in at some point and comment on that. And then the last question in this round is coming from Malta Rivera Ferre. And she's asking whether universal access to reproductive health is also included in the report, noting that this has impacts on food security and nutrition as well. So in terms of the way we respond to this, I'll come to you, Prof, first for a general overview of what you have had and those questions specifically directed at you, your team, and the report that you're working on. And then I'll go to Dorothy at the World Health Organization. And then we will hear from Saima if she wants to respond to the question posed or the comment by Judith. Prof, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Really very valuable resources, suggestions, comments. Many members of our team are present at this meeting today, and we're all busy scribbling away, taking notes, and there will be a recording, of course, so we will have a chance to go back and listen again and make sure that we've taken on board everything that has been said. Thank you. Really grateful for that. Just to quickly respond to some of these, I may not be able to capture all of them, but universal access to reproductive health. We have a discussion as part of, if you recall, in our report, we are covering not only inequalities within the food system, strictly speaking, but surrounding systems such as sanitation, health, education, which have a bearing upon food security and nutrition. And certainly within those aspects, we touch upon some of these aspects that you referred to. And likewise, in the solution space, there is a transformative action around universal access, which touches upon some of these aspects. Of course, even with, we're not able to do full justice to each of these discussions because there are so many elements that are important within this overall umbrella. So feel free at the consultation stage to let us know if you think we haven't said enough about a particular aspect, or indeed reach out to us personally. We'd all be delighted to hear from anyone about individual aspects that we could pay a bit more attention to. And we will certainly take on board all those comments. I should also, so in terms of social safety networks, also having food as a part of that, again, an aspect that we touch upon, but don't elaborate too much, even with limited attention to individual aspects. We have a 100+ page report right now. So really to bound it, we have to think for the next version about how to get all this important information, have a proper discussion of all these elements, and yet keep the report reasonably readable, snappy, and so that people don't have to spend ages trying to get the messages out. So we have to think of some strategies surrounding that. But some of these aspects have been addressed, but perhaps not enough. We will take a look again. Traditional solidarity networks, I'm afraid we haven't really gone there yet, but notes have been taken, and we will certainly go back and engage with this as we go along. Thank you also for the number of suggestions about smallholder development, the resources. I've again taken notes on all of these aspects. Some of these we have touched upon in various parts of the report. Certainly there is quite a lot of focus on smallholders in various parts of the report, whether it's at the production end or input provision end, but also connectivity to value chains and so on. But again, these resources, some of these we will sound very interesting, and we'd be happy to go back. HLPE-13, again, something that we've looked at before. We've tried to make connections to previous HLPEs, but that may be an area where we strengthen as well. So, yeah, I think that's all I have to say in response to this round of comments. Thank you. We are very grateful, and I hope that we can be in touch either through the consultation process or through direct emailing, and we can continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And to really echo your word and say, let's share these comments if we can through the consultations that's open, so that then the team is able to find these comments inputs in a place where they are structured in a way that they can make good use of them. But as Prof has said, they're busy scribbling away, so let's keep them busy. Let's keep sharing with them. Dorothy, if you're still with us, there was that question on the linkage between workers' occupational and workplace health and the ILO conference. Do you want to speak to that briefly? Dorothy, are you still with us? I saw her online, and she had committed she would respond to that. And so we'll move from that question and check with Saima. Saima, there was a comment that came from Judith. And Judith had just put a comment on chat why she's unable to respond. She's unfortunately in intensive cardiac care, and this speaks to her commitment to be speaking and contributing to this discussion even in that state. Judith, if you can hear us, we wish you quick recovery. But Saima, there was a question around the remarks you made and connecting that with examples from other regions. Do you want to come in here?
Hi. Yes, there was actually an example like I shared. Actually, it was like they did it like they merged some programs there, and they wanted to make the difference. They reached out to the poorest, and they tried to search, or like they tried to stop the children to going for the labor, and they provide some type of support to the families, and they reached out through the women and the mothers of the children in the school, and they provide food there. So this was actually, they involved local farmers, they involved the local people who were there. So this was like there are some of the, still the criticism is there, but they have been able to make a significant difference in that. So my point was to mentioning it that, like, when we were not involving the corporations, and we are more focusing of the indigenous people to the local food producers and the local market suppliers, that can make the more difference than rather than the corporations, because they are just to make profit, and they just, they are getting benefit from the governments too, and they are enjoying the tax holidays and all this, but still the governments are not promoting their local food producers and their local market suppliers, and how they can reach out to the poorest of the poor. So this is also can provide like a model, like how you can reach out there. So it's like like you can read it, and it's a very long, so I can explain right now the whole process, but that was my point actually, to give that example. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those supplemental points. I'll go now to the audience in the room. We have a hand up right at my extreme right.
Thank you very much. I'm Lucas Sebastian from Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism. I look forward to reading the Zero draft, and I'm certainly extremely interested in seeing whether or not the impacts of colonization, racism and discrimination has on food security and nutrition, and if those are mentioned in the report. Global food governance is quite often dominated by powerful states looking after their own interests, and trade agreements often facilitate the destruction of local and indigenous food systems in order to extract profit in all countries. So the question, how do we create a just, sustainable and culturally appropriate food system or food systems which support strong local economies will not be answered unless these issues are confronted head on. So my question to the HLPE is as follows. Whether or not the structural and systemic drivers of food insecurity, such as colonization, colonialism, racism, and discrimination, are considered in the report, and if they are not, why not? And then to follow up on the strong words by Florence from UN Habitat, will the report highlight how the transformation of the food system can support decolonization and can put an end to racism and discrimination in the future if we all work hard and get things done? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, CSIPM, for those very clear questions. And we have a request from the back.
Good afternoon, everyone. Matheus from the Global Alliance for the Future Food and also the Philanthropic Mechanism for CFS. First of all, congratulations to the HLPE team. Happy to see that the V0 is already online, and I was scrolling through it, and we'll also use part of our time to reflect upon the conclusions and the content. We did provide a contribution to the scope, and we gladly saw that some of our thinking was already acknowledged in this report, particularly on keeping the scope comprehensive to address the structural barriers to food to inequalities and their impacts on food systems. Just a comment that is something that we do appreciate when reading those reports and reflecting on how they also impact on our own work is the examples of successful experiences. I think all HLP report carries a wealth of good examples of how things can be addressed, and they're always very inspiring. We appreciate, for example, some of those that are already there, but I think we could have more. Like we just spoke about a couple of examples here, the history of social protection in Latin America. I think also the report could be helpful in bringing the framework that you have developed back when providing those examples. So we spoke of inequalities in recognition, representation, and distribution, and maybe just reusing that framework to suggest where do we see examples of good representation that addresses inequalities or good recognition that addresses inequalities. I think that also could be very helpful for having a sharp report. And obviously the scope is very comprehensive, is vast, and I understand that there might be some, down the road, there might be some discussions on how to focus that in the policy negotiations. But I think the reports, the HLP reports, are becoming increasingly internationally recognized because of its comprehensiveness. So we should not reduce the ambition there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your interventions and the comments, which I believe the team has taken note of and they'll be responding to. And I've just seen feedback from Jane Battersby to the question raised by CSIPM, and the response is yes. We do address colonialism, racism, and deep structural drivers, and the need for the inclusion of indigenous and traditional knowledge systems, analyzing the problems and seeking solutions. So sharp, short, and quick response to that. I'll now take two more questions that came in through chat. The first one is for you. Just allow me one moment. To Dr. Quisumbing, our first panelist. And the question for you is, what are the implications of all these findings to programs and policies, all this work that we are describing here? How will it impact programs and policies? And very closely tied to that, and I probably think this will go to Professor Shankar and to our panelists as well, and I'll start with you, Matt, is what can the CFS and the audience of this HLPE report do? What are we expecting? What kind of changes are we looking to see out of this? So I'll go first to you, Dr. Quisumbing, and then to Matt, and see who of our other panelists wants to respond to any of those questions. Dr. Quisumbing?
Great, thank you. When translating a lot of these findings to programs and policies, I think it's very important to note that we might think globally, but we always implement locally. So gender inequalities manifest themselves differently in different countries and contexts because social norms are so different. And the intersection of wealth and gender inequality can have extremely different manifestations in different countries. So for example, in South Asia, you see, for example, higher gender inequality within the household as wealth increases. So this means that policies can't be one size fits all, and you really need very good people on the ground to be able to to design and shape these policies. So I want also, although this question was not addressed to me, this question about positive examples, I think we also learn a lot from negative examples, because one of the things that we've found in our, we've done impact evaluations of portfolios of agricultural development that try to address gender inequality, is that when you transplant a model from one context to another, it often doesn't work. And so maybe some negative examples might be helpful as a warning for those who try to replicate without attention to context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Quisumbing. And there's a question, and I'm reading these out because it's on chat and for the benefit of those in the room. Sonia Ado asked whether financial inclusion is considered in the report, and Professor Shankar just responded on chat and said, indeed, they include financial inclusion in the report. Matt, I had a question for you, and I'll ask this question to all our panelists, so please get prepared. How does this report or the work that CFS is doing, what do we do more? How does this impact, affect the work that we are doing? Starting with you, Matt.
Thank you for this question. And in fact, maybe I should defer the response to Professor Shankar, but I wanted to highlight on this idea of building on past CFS HLPE reports. One of the things that's most important, at least from the analysis I've been looking at, is the importance of having and analyzing the right data, and that's obviously a foundational short-term building block for any medium or longer-term strategy. And then it would be a question of getting that analysis into the hands of the right policymakers. But before that can happen, we just need more and better data.
Thank you, Matt. And I have a follow-up question for you, Matt, which is, what are the data sources that you have looked at so far? And I've just seen a comment around, again, reinforcing that comment about positive examples and probably even negative examples. But what data sources have we referenced? And I'm saying this because US had lots of data in it, your presentation.
Thank you. So the data that we were using was largely macroeconomic aggregate data from the United Nations System of National Accounts and from our World Inequality database. And that can give, in the best case, a picture of overall inequality, but it's very difficult to dive into the more micro data and refined picture of the most vulnerable populations. And this is something we've only been able to do for a very reduced sample. And the best source that I've found is indeed this partnership between FAO, World Bank, and IFAD, the Rural Livelihoods Information System, and drawing particularly on LSMS systems and the ISA data. So I think if anybody here also has further suggestions for what data might be out there, until then or otherwise, I think we're just looking for more data that can help us answer these questions.
Thank you, Matt. Professor Shankar, do we want to come to you first? And it's essentially around, there's actually a question for you directly from Nora McKeown, and she's asking, and she's saying one good source of positive examples are the two popular consultations that the CSIPM has conducted in 2020 and this year, gathering evidence from the ground about the impacts of COVID and conflicts and community responses and proposals. And she's asking, are you looking at those? And then there's a question from Evelyn Rageb, and she's asking, what about small-scale fisheries? Are we looking at that as a sector and the workers in that sector? And for you, Prof, the last question that I'm asking to all the panelists is, then what can CFS do, or what can the audience of the HLPE report do? Over to you, Prof.
Thank you. So just to go back to some of these questions, comments, Nora, thank you very much for these for the suggestion about the reports that the CSIPM has been working on. I can't say that I've seen that before, so we would love to follow up with you and find out a bit more and get access to the documents and proceed to take account of them. It sounds really interesting for those positive examples that we've talked about. Agnes's point about negative examples as well is really well taken. I think we have a lot of negative examples in the report right now, in the sense that those are the ones that get talked about a lot and in research. And so we really wanted to balance out with some positive examples as well, but certainly learning from mistakes that have been made or things that have just happened that have not led to the best outcomes, I think is really, really important. So we continue to request positive, negative, interesting, pertinent examples would be perfect, because we already have several text boxes with examples to explain particular ideas that are being presented. And we'd love to give a more sort of example-driven flavor to many of our discussions. So please do get in touch, and we will follow up on some of these suggestions that have been made. Small-scale fisheries, Evelyn's asked. Thank you. Yes, we recognize that's very important. In fact, we have some discussion of the inequalities within small-scale fisheries. We are lucky enough in the team to have Professor Christina Hicks, who is a expert on small-scale fisheries around the world, who is lending her expertise. We want to do more in fisheries towards VEEV1, so please be patient if you don't see everything that you might expect. We hope to add a bit more out there. And I also see that Shiny Varghese has asked about casteism. We do touch upon caste, and not separately by itself, but it appears in different parts of the report wherever it becomes most relevant. So we do touch upon that. And then finally about the policy process and where it goes from here. Yes, absolutely. So there's a long process, as you know, involved here. So from this V0, e-consultation happens. Simultaneously, we're also trying to think of that strategy that I mentioned of making the report a bit shorter and more readable, but also maintaining all the detailed discussions. So we're trying to find workarounds so that we can retain some of the rich detail that's there, but at the same time make it accessible to various people. Very much towards the end of the report, we get into concrete recommendations, and we will have a concluding chapter with recommendations. And the process thereon, as it will go into peer review after the e-consultation is finished and the next version comes out, and after peer review, it will go to the it will go from being a report in progress to a report that's presented to the CFS, and the policy process starts from there on. And as you all know better than I do, that there is a long process involved going from there. So, but hopefully we are presenting solutions, both long-term and short-term, that can be taken up, and that eventually will become part of, we very much hope, the policy process. And we will, of course, as a team, be ready to support that in any way that we can. Yeah, that's all I have to say, I think. If anyone else in the team wants to add anything, they are most welcome to, but thank you.
Thank you, Prof. That's very helpful, and I see some members of your team are also helping by supplementing some of these questions and answers, and I'll just reading them out for purposes of colleagues in the room. Maria Elena Huambachano has responded to that question by Evelyn about small-scale fisheries, and she says, yes, we focus on labor rights and the role of small-scale farmers in transforming the food system. So just going even beyond small-scale fisheries. So meaning small-scale farmers are also included in the work that Professor Shankar and his team are doing. Professor, just before I let you go, there is a question that came from Shaini Vahes, and she contextualizes it within a number of countries, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and India. And she says, in addition to colonialism and racism, casteism, the caste system, is extremely important, and hope that will be considered as well in this work that you're doing. Is that the case, Prof, that you'll be looking at the caste system and how it impacts or creates inequalities?
Correct. Yes, absolutely. So caste is an important but not highly studied, except for a certain scholarship that exists in South Asia. It is not widely read, the literature, and it has got lots and lots of interesting and lots of very useful work that's come out in the last few years, and we do have scattered discussion of that. We don't treat that as a separate topic by itself, but wherever caste becomes particularly relevant, we do address caste-based issues. For example, there is a literature around caste-based inequalities in some nutritious food consumption. There is also caste-based inequalities in land distribution. And so some solid scholarship that's happened in those areas, which we do pick up on. Again, like everything else, I think it's something that we could do more on, and we'll be alive to any opportunities to do that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Prof. We'll let you and your team carry on with the listening and distilling what's coming through, and even probably continue responding to some of those questions that are coming across via chat. There's actually one on conflicts, wars, and occupation, and Hala, who has asked this question, says they are important drivers of inequalities. And I wonder if the report covers those points. So I hope someone on your team will respond to that on chat, and I will share the response with the rest of the audience. I'll go to the other panelists because I had asked them a question, and I see there's a request for the floor from the room. So I'll ask the other panelists to respond to the question on what can CFS do and what can the audience of the HLPE report do. And I'll start with you, Megha Desai, and then I'll go to Saima Zia, the ones who haven't responded. And I see another hand in the room. So once Megha and Saima have responded, I'll give the floor to the two people who have requested for the floor in the room. Megha?
Thank you. So what we have learned is the ownership building of the informal sector women workers is important to address the inequalities. And that is why what we suggest is we will make the report understandable to our members and make it simpler and talk with them, gather their suggestions and come up with the suggestions to CFS panel. That is very important because we feel that the ownership, not only the suggestion, but inclusion of informal sector women, right from the data to the decision making and the accessibility and ownership of data is very important. And to CFS, the suggestion is whatever are the research and the outcomes, the very important is the actions on ground at the country level. So if we can develop the mechanism that actions can be seen about the report, that will be very useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Megha. Saima?
Okay, thank you. As Megha said, I totally agree with her. And also, you know, when we talk about the ownership and data access, and especially, you know, like the response from the countries like Pakistan, the government response is very important. If the government is not taking the ownership, is not fully involved in all these processes, it is very difficult for the civil society to implement these things there. And one more thing, just I want to suggest, like there should be some, when we talk about the data and all these things, that we, people in Pakistan, how much they have access to the data. It's like most of the data is not available. Government is not sharing the things which should be shared publicly. And most importantly, the translation in local languages is also very important. It's not only in the UN, you know, like official languages, but people, country like Pakistan, they can't read most of the languages which are UN official languages. So I think that should also be focused. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Saima, for those reflections. I'll now take the two questions or comments from the room as we approach the tail end of our session this afternoon. I'll go to you first.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Inmaculada del Pino Alvarez. I'm representing IDLO, the International Development Law Organization, and I'm very happy of being here and be part of this discussion. I want to congratulate the HLPE for the report, and also thank him for sharing all this information from the different panelists. It's been a very rich discussion today. I was wondering, because I thought that in the report is including, the aspect of governance has been included and mentioned, in different interventions, but I was wondering whether the rule of law perspective is also being considered in the report. So the rule of law, as many of you know, is a principle of governance which are based in three main elements, let's say, so how to enhance transparency, accountability, and promoting the access to justice. And most of the inequalities as well touches on the injustice system. So across food system, there are a number of inequalities, and here you mentioned a number of them, but also access to justice is one of the inequalities. And there are some mechanisms, to empower participation, as you mentioned, that can enhance of all those three principles. For example, looking at how to strengthen the interconnections in between social norms, as you mentioned, and statutory laws through, customary injustice system mechanisms or alternative dispute resolutions, and also how to provide some redress mechanism to people who suffer for these injustices and inequalities, and also remedies. So just wondering, I look forward to reading the report, of course, and providing more comments, but I think these elements could also be included. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we're delighted to have IDLO in the room providing these perspectives. Florence?
Yeah, in terms of positive examples, I was wondering if the cocinas populares in Peru could be an interesting example. It was women from low-income groups getting organized to feed their children while others were going to work. And actually, it developed into a very strong political movement and a lot of empowerment of these women's group. I think a lot of them made a political career eventually. So I was thinking this could be also, it is part of the food sector, and it could be an interesting box. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florence. I don't see any more requests for the floor. What I'll do now is, Professor Shankar, I know we have heard quite a lot from you, but I'll just request that you respond specifically to the last two questions and give us your general impression of the discussion today, and then I'll take the floor and provide a wrap-up as we conclude the session. Over to you, Professor Shankar.
Thank you. About rule of law, not specifically, so we don't include the aspects that you've discussed. As you noted, we have a governance section, we have a right to food section as part of our transformative change aspects. But we'd be very interested in picking up the sorts of things that you just mentioned. And thank you. I've just made some notes as you were speaking. And we would love to touch base with you and perhaps have an email exchange about what you would recommend us to read and pick up with regard to this aspect, because it certainly sounds very relevant. So we'd be happy to do that. And just to say, for the positive example from Peru, thank you very much. We will look it up, and it sounds very interesting, and happy to take it into account as we go forward. Thank you.
Many thanks, Prof, for taking us through the report itself and responding to the many questions that have come across. Again, thanks to everyone who joined us this afternoon for the incredible inputs, insights that you have shared. Believe Prof and his team will take those into consideration. And as we get to the point of wrapping it up, allow me to also thank colleagues on the CFS Secretariat and the HLPE Secretariat who have done tremendous amounts of work to get this process going. We thank colleagues both at IFAD and FAO in the audiovisual teams and the interpreters for facilitating this process and making it possible for us to understand each other. But I think more importantly is thanking you, the participants who joined us today. I will provide a very brief overview of how the discussion went, picked up about 5 or so key points that came across as a summary of the discussion. And as I said at the very beginning, a link to this recording will be posted on the CFS website, will be available for future viewing. We encourage you to share it with those who would have wanted to participate in this discussion but they weren't. But more importantly is engage with the process that Professor Shankar and his team are driving. So what have you had? The first one is there are vast and in many cases increasing inequalities in the food system, and they significantly constrain food security and nutrition. That message has come across very clearly. The second one is that there's quite a lot of work that's happening. Tons of good examples, but also bad examples, and they're all important. The third point speaks specifically to the HLPE report, which looks at these inequalities in about 4 so categories. The first one is on distribution of resources, power and opportunities. The other one is recognition, the visibility, valuation and status of certain groups and social identities. The third one is representation, and this refers to an equal political, socio-economic representation. And all these dimensions, as Professor said, are related and they reinforce each other. The fourth point is that food system inequalities have systemic and structural drivers, social norms, political economy, fragility, conflicts, etc., all which needs to be considered if we are to address inequality in its true nature. And then the final one is that long-lasting and effective reduction in these inequalities will benefit food security. And the CFS chair started by giving us three key elements of those, is ensuring that smallholder and family farmers are at the heart of that work we're doing. We're empowering women, and the jobs that we are creating in the agri-food sector are decent jobs. I know there's quite a lot of other nuanced points that came across. I didn't leave any intentionally, but as we said, Professor Shankar and his team have taken note of all these points. The recording will be available. And once again, we thank you very much for joining us and for your contribution this afternoon. We'll close the meeting at this point. Thank you.